It sat between a broken pocket watch and faded photographs, his own Distinguished Service Medal from Vietnam, the one they'd given him in 1971, the one his family had sold after his wife's funeral. Now a stranger was calling it worthless military junk. He didn't argue. He just stood there, remembering the day he earned it. Welcome to ANZAC War Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of loss, memory, and unexpected recognition, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe these stories of our forgotten veterans deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. Their silence was earned. Now it's time we speak for them. The antique shop on Collins Street had seen better days. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months. Glass cabinets lined the walls, filled with forgotten treasures that once meant everything to someone. China sets from deceased grandmothers, wedding rings from failed marriages, and military memorabilia from wars most people preferred to forget. Behind the counter, Marcus Webb, the shop owner, scrolled through his phone, barely acknowledging the few customers who wandered in. He was young, early 30s, with the kind of confidence that came from inheriting a business rather than building one. To him, the items in his shop were just inventory, price tags and profit margins, nothing more. That Tuesday afternoon, an elderly man pushed through the front door. He moved slowly but deliberately, his weathered hands gripping a walking stick that had seen as many miles as he had. His clothes were simple, a faded cardigan, pressed trousers, and shoes that were polished despite their age. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and said too little. His name was Frank Morrison, though the world had long forgotten that name. At 78, he lived alone in a small flat in Prahran, surviving on a veteran's pension and the memories of a war that had ended before most people were born. He visited antique shops not to buy, but to remember. Sometimes he'd find items that reminded him of his youth, his service, his late wife, Margaret. Frank moved slowly through the narrow aisles, his walking stick tapping softly against the wooden floor. He paused at a cabinet filled with military items, old helmets, badges, photographs of soldiers whose names were lost to time. And then he saw it. There, nestled between a broken pocket watch and a stack of faded photographs, was his Distinguished Service Medal. The bronze star gleamed dully under the fluorescent lights, its purple and green ribbon still intact after all these years. Frank's breath caught in his throat. He knew it was his, not just because it looked the same, they all looked the same, but because of the tiny scratch on the back edge where it had caught on a tree branch during a patrol in Long Tan, because of the way the clasp was slightly bent from the day he'd fallen during an ambush, because of the memory that came flooding back the moment he saw it. Frank approached the counter slowly. Marcus looked up from his phone with the practiced smile of someone who dealt with browsing pensioners every day. "Afternoon," Marcus said without much enthusiasm. "Looking for anything particular?" Frank pointed toward the display case with his walking stick. "That medal there, the DSM. Could you tell me about it?" Marcus glanced over, then back to Frank with a slight shrug. "Oh, that old thing. Came in last week from an estate sale. Previous owner died, family just wanted to clear everything out quickly." He paused, studying Frank's worn clothes and modest appearance. "It's priced at $75, but to be honest, it's probably not worth half that. These Vietnam-era medals, there's not much demand for them anymore." Frank's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "May I see it?" Marcus sighed and walked over to the cabinet, pulling out a ring of keys. "Sure, but like I said, it's probably not authentic anyway. A lot of reproductions floating around from that era, soldiers coming back, wanting souvenirs for their mates. You know how it is." He handed Frank the medal, and the old man's fingers trembled slightly as he took it. The weight was familiar, the metal cool against his palm. He turned it over, and there it was, the tiny scratch, the bent clasp, and something else Marcus hadn't noticed, engraved in small letters along the edge, F. Morrison, 7RAR, 1971. "Where did you say this came from?" Frank asked quietly. "Estate sale in Turak," Marcus replied, already losing interest. "Rich widow, husband died of cancer. She was selling everything, furniture, clothes, personal effects, Probably picked it up at a garage sale years ago thinking it was worth something. He chuckled. These old-timers love collecting military stuff. Makes them feel connected to history, I suppose. Frank continued to hold the metal, his thumb tracing the familiar scratches and dents. Memories flooded back. The helicopter landing in a clearing near Long Tan, the sound of gunfire in the distance, the wounded soldier he'd carried to safety under enemy fire. The ceremony in Saigon where a general had pinned this very medal to his chest while cameras flashed and other soldiers watched. "I'll take it," Frank said simply. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Like I said, it's probably not authentic. You could get a replica online for $20. "I said I'll take it." Marcus shrugged and rang up the sale. As Frank counted out exact change from a worn wallet, the shop owner couldn't resist one final comment. "You know, I get a lot of old blokes in here claiming these medals belong to their fathers or grandfathers, always trying to negotiate the price down with some sob story." He handed Frank the receipt. "Good on you for just paying the asking price." Frank tucked the medal carefully into his cardigan pocket and headed for the door. He paused at the threshold and turned back. "That sob story you mentioned," he said quietly. "Sometimes it's not a story at all." Then he was gone, leaving Marcus alone with his phone and his ignorance. Frank walked slowly down Collins Street, the medal's weight familiar against his chest. He thought about Margaret, about how proud she'd been of his service, how she'd polished that medal every ANZAC day until arthritis made it too painful. He thought about the dark months after her death, when grief had made him careless with possessions that suddenly seemed meaningless without her there to share them. He didn't blame his children for selling it. They had their own lives, their own struggles. The medal was just another item to them, another piece of their father's mysterious past that he'd never talked about. They'd tried to be respectful, donating most of his military items to the RSL, but a few pieces had slipped through the cracks, ending up in estate sales and antique shops. That evening, Frank sat in his small kitchen, the medal on the table before him. He picked up his phone, a simple model that his daughter had bought him, and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. "Bill?" "It's Frank Morrison." "Yes, I'm fine. Listen, I need a favor. Do you still have that contact at the Herald-Sun, the journalist who did the ANZAC Day feature last year?" "Yes, I think it's time I told someone a story." The next morning, Marcus arrived at his shop to find a journalist waiting outside with a photographer. The story that appeared in that afternoon's Herald-Sun was simple but powerful. Vietnam veteran forced to buy back his own medal. It included Frank's full military record, 2 tours of duty, the rescue operation that earned him the DSM, and his 50 years of silence about his service. It mentioned the antique shop by name and included a quote from Marcus dismissing the medal as probably fake and complaining about old-timers with sob stories. By evening, the shop's Google reviews had dropped to 1 star. The RSL had issued a statement. The Vietnamese Australian community had organized a boycott, and Marcus Webb learned the hard way that sometimes the old man browsing your shop isn't just another customer. Frank Morrison never returned to the antique shop. He didn't need to. His medal was back where it belonged, and his story, the one he'd kept silent for 50 years, was finally being heard. Not because he demanded recognition, but because sometimes the truth has a way of finding its voice. 2 weeks later, Marcus Webb closed his shop permanently. Not because of the boycotts or the bad publicity, but because he'd finally understood what his grandfather, a Kokoda veteran who died when Marcus was young, had tried to teach him years ago, that some things are worth more than their price tag, and some stories deserve more respect than a casual dismissal. Frank kept the medal in a small box on his kitchen table next to a photograph of Margaret, and every morning, as he drank his tea and watched the sunrise through his window, he remembered not the war or the medal or the recognition, but the words Margaret used to say every ANZAC Day. "You came home, Frank. That's all that mattered to me." Some medals are earned in war. Others are earned in the quiet dignity of carrying that war home and living with it in silence until someone finally asks the right questions. Frank Morrison had earned both. So tell me, have you ever met someone like Frank? Someone whose quiet presence carried more history than they ever revealed? Someone whose story was hidden behind modest clothes and careful words until one moment brought it to light? Share their name in the comments. Tell us what you learned from them. Because here at ANZAC War Stories, we believe that every veteran's story matters, especially the ones they never tell. Subscribe to make sure these stories are never forgotten. And remember, sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones standing quietly beside you, carrying their history in silence until someone finally looks close enough to see the truth, lest we forget.